Hi, I'm Nurse Bob. Today I'm going to continue talking about total parenteral nutrition and hydration at the end of life. And by the end of life I mean sort of the last 90 days. My focus here is the body able to use the fluids and the nutrition that we are offering. In terms of structure, I'm going to talk first about sort of the components of the blood and how they relate to our ability to hold on to fluids that we're putting into the bloodstream. And then I'll do a brief model on something called osmosis, which is a natural process that governs the direction that water flows when there's a barrier that lets water through, but has elements of different concentrations on either side of that barrier. And then finally I'll show you a time-lapse video I made. It's a simple experiment I did that demonstrates how osmosis works, just so you have a better idea of what's going on. So I hope you find this interesting and enjoyable, and that down the road you'll have information you can work with. Thank you. Now I'd like to talk about the blood components. What makes up the blood? Blood is primarily composed of plasma, which is 55% of the blood, and red blood cells, which are 45%. So the plasma, which I'm going to describe in a moment, is made up of a bunch of other components. The red blood cells, of course, that's transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide. The oxygen goes to the body and the carbon dioxide goes to the lungs and back out. So what's in the plasma? Well, it's 91% water, and water is a big deal. We're going to be talking about that. Proteins make up 7% of the plasma. And there are salts. Of course, table salt, we're all familiar with, is one of the primary salts. It's, sodium chloride. And then glucose, which is the sugar, which is the fuel for the body. That's 0.1%, 0.1%. And we talked about glucose in detail when we talked about diabetes, so I'm not going to go into that right now. But let's talk about the plasma proteins. So there's the albumins, and they make up 60% of the plasma proteins. They have two jobs. Primarily, they help manage the pressure that moves the water in and out of the bloodstream, and manages the fluid balance between the tissues and the blood. And they also participate in transport various chemicals throughout the body. The next major protein component are the immunoglobulins, which function as part of our immune system. And then finally there are regulatory proteins, and there are tens of thousands of proteins actually, and the regulatory proteins are in that group of thousands. And their job is to regulate various body processes. They speed things up, slow them down, stop them, start them. Just what you would expect a regulatory protein to do. So in general, that's kind of where the blood is, and we're going to talk a lot about albumins and water, because that's what goes on when you're managing fluid balance in the tissues and in the bloodstream. So next, I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about the tissue and blood, and then we'll go on to talk about osmosis specifically, and then finally I'll show you that video that I made, the time lapse. Thank you for your time. Now I want to talk about fluid balance between the bloodstream and the tissues. So all the little blue dots in here represent albumin, which when there's enough albumin in the system, and the albumin is balanced, say, between the tissue and the bloodstream, the water, migrates back and forth equally. But if we don't have enough albumin in the bloodstream, or if we have a lot more out here, the water's going to move out. The water's going to move out of the bloodstream and into the tissue. And ultimately that causes swelling because it doesn't move backwards. And what controls the albumin? Well, that's the liver. our liver makes albumin, and if you're sick, the liver is challenged in doing other jobs, and so it actually tends not to make as much albumin. And albumin is used as a measure of our nutritional health. We actually look at the albumin levels and the pre-albumin levels. Pre-albumin are the components that make up albumin, and they're in the bloodstream, and you can measure them. And if the albumin is low, it tells us that you haven't been doing well nutritionally. But the other aspect of that is you swell up, and so that's really all I really wanted to say about that at the moment. I'll get onto my video. Time-lapse video here in a couple of minutes, and we'll show that, and you can see which way the fluid moves. And thanks for your time. Talk to you soon. Hi, I'm Nurse Bob, and I'm still talking about osmosis. So this is a really simple model. Let's say we've got a beaker filled with water in this thing in the middle. It's called a semi-permeable membrane, which just means it lets water through, maybe some other molecules through, depends on size, and nothing else. So in this beaker I've got water and water with some other substance here, and this stuff, this green stuff is too big to go through the membrane, so it can't go through. It's stuck. It can't get there. However, the water is small enough that it can pass through. It can go through these little pores here. And what happens is the water keeps going through, and since nature abhors this, a vacuum or imbalances, it wants to get the same number of water molecules on this side in relation to the number of water molecules and this substance on that side. And the result is a net movement. It all keeps moving this way. And what will happen is this beaker will fill just like my flask did, and it would actually overflow in an attempt to keep the water moving through to get this so that this is the same dilution as this. And that's sort of the principle behind osmosis. Is you've got something that's too big to get through, you've got water on both sides, and water trying to make a balanced solution on both sides. That's really all there is to it. With the body, it's a little more complex than that, because we've got more than just one big molecule, and we've got some other small molecules that can move both ways, and ions, salts, dissolved salts. So it gets a little more complex, but for now, that's a reasonable model of osmosis, because where we're going with this is in the body when somebody is near death, and we're giving them TPN, we are pumping in not only some large molecules, but the blood vessels don't have the large molecules on both sides to help balance out the flow. And ultimately what happens is the water moves from inside the blood vessels to outside being into the tissue, and then ultimately out through the skin. So I'll be talking more about that later. But for now, this is a basic model of osmosis and what goes on. Built a little experiment to demonstrate osmosis. My production project supervisor here. So water with iodine is being pumped through dialysis tubing into a flask that's filled with fructose and starch. And osmosis is the process that will help the water, or draw the water from the dialysis tubing and into the flask. So we can see we start out with 700 mLs of water and iodine in the beaker, and this actually took about 2 hours for this actually to rise from the 2 liters up to the max that it did. And we can see we dropped about 50 mLs in the beaker, and that it's also much lighter in color. And you can also see the blue coloring. The water in the flask has changed color. Well, I appreciate your time. I think we've pretty much covered what I wanted to cover in terms of how fluid balance is managed via osmosis between the blood vessels and the tissue. And the next topic next week is going to be more specific to TPN, the total parenteral nutrition, and end of life, and sort of the at that point, the pathophysiology, what's going on, and how that impacts our loved ones or ourselves if we're the ones making this decision. And at that point, hopefully you'll have enough information to ask all the questions you need to ask so you can make decisions that are in the best interest of either yourself or your loved one. And thank you for your time. I'm Nurse Bob. We'll talk next week.